Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to introduce our two panelists. So, Diane Gérin-Lajoie. Diane Gérin-Lajoie is a critical sociologist of education, professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, at the University of Toronto, and former head of the Centre de recherche en éducation franco-ontarienne. Her research interests focus primarily on French minority language education and English minority language education in Canada, the process of identity construction, and teaching in minority settings. She is also a QUESCREN researcher member. Brendan O'Donnell, historian and retired civil servant, began a bibliography on English-speaking Quebec through a paid summer project here at Concordia University in the 1970s, and has been in 1978. And he continued to compile it on his own for the past 40 years, and that bibliography is hosted by QUESCREN at quescren.concordia.ca, and he'll be talking about the rise and fall of English Quebec studies, what he's seen over the past 40 years of compiling that bibliography and in his broader experience.
So I'm going this morning to talk to you about, I'm going to talk about Ontario. I just want to tell you where I come from, because I'm a French-speaking. I'm from Quebec. I've lived in Quebec until I went to Toronto to do my PhD at OISE. And so I'm a real Francophone. That at the time that I grew up, there were really a big division between Anglophones and Francophones. So that's why for me it's so interesting to have begun to study Anglophones in Quebec, because it's fascinating for me. So I did first, my research was done on Francophones in Ontario, and more specifically on youth, on kids in high schools, and how they make sense of their identity. So I did that for a while, and my other field is teachers that are working in minority settings. So I did quite a lot of work on the French language schools in Ontario, to, at some point, being quite interested to see what was the reality for the other official minority. And for me, it's really important to keep in mind that I'm looking at both linguistic minorities, but as being the official minorities in Canada, because that's different from other linguistic minorities. And I'm a sociologist of education, as Patrick said, and I'm looking at ethnic studies, race relation studies, to try to understand the notion of identity as being more as a social construct than, I'm not taking a psychological viewpoint when I look at identity. So in that context, social contexts are really, really important for me when I look at linguistic minorities. So I got very interested in the notion of bilingual identity when I began my career, because at the time, the only studies that were done were more from a quantitative standpoint in research. And when the researchers, when they were talking about bilingual identity, they always concluding as saying, well, it's really a step towards assimilation to the majority. I was really intrigued by that notion, and that's when I really began to think about that. What does it mean? Is it really assimilation? Is it a new way of looking at who you are? And I'm a qualitative researcher, so I don't do statistics, so for me it's important in order to be able to understand the complexity of social practices, I'm always looking at like a micro lens when I do research. So, and the kids were high school kids. The study on teachers, the same thing, qualitative research. In that case, for the teachers in Ontario, in French language schools in Ontario, or the teachers in Anglophone school in Quebec, I was interested to see how their professional identity would be influenced by their own personal identity as an Anglophone, or as a minority member of a minority population. But to my really big surprise, when I began to work in schools, I realized that a lot of the teachers in English-speaking schools are French, Francophones. So it really, it's very interesting. So my goal is to continue to do comparative analysis between the two groups in both provinces. So now you know where I come from. I'm going to try to spare you with details that you probably all know, but I just want to try to keep my comparative lens. And in terms of the minority population, when you look in Quebec, this is a new figure. Usually people use 1,058,000 Anglophones in Quebec. But the numbers, those numbers are from 2016, so it's a little bit higher. And Francophones in Ontario, that's where you find the most Francophones outside of Quebec, but because the province is so big, they really constitute just a small number of people, a small percentage of people. And one thing that I think sometimes it's not obvious is that usually people talk in terms of mother tongue or first language when they calculate the number of people. But now Statistics Canada have a new ways of getting those numbers, and it's not just based on the mother tongue, but it's mother tongue, the language the most frequently spoken at home, and the knowledge of the official language. So instead of just one criterion, they go with 3 criteria. So it makes the numbers bigger. As you probably know, we have regulations for education in the language of the minority. We have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms with Article 23. So it's an article that gives the right to people who live in a minority setting to have their parents, to have their children instructed in their language, in their minority language. And before that, like in Quebec, it's since Bill 101 that we have Article 72 that really explain who can go to English-speaking school and who can't. And they add to the Bill 101 was revised for that particular article when the charter was passed in 1982. Just to give you an idea of education in Ontario, French minority language in Ontario. When I'm talking, first of all, when I'm talking about French as a minority language of instruction, I'm not talking about French immersion. It's really, the schools are really schools where French is the first language of instruction. It's not in, and it's controlled by school boards that are entirely Francophones. So we have 12 of those school boards in Ontario, and we have a total, and numbers of schools, it's always, you read one place, it's that number, and you read at another, document, and the numbers are always different, but it's about 430 schools. Our population, the school population, is diverse at the language level, but also at the cultural level. We receive quite a bit of immigrants that have the French either as a first language or as a second language. So the school, and that's what is interesting for me as a researcher. In Ontario and everywhere else for Francophones outside of Quebec, the mandate of the school is not only to transmit or co-construct knowledge with the students or socialize to the dominant values in society, but it's also to help to maintain the minority language and the minority culture. So that's interesting, because when you look at Quebec, when you look at the ministry's document, there is nothing on that. If you go back in the 1990s in the Chamber's report, there was notice that the culture and the language was something to not to see only in terms of technical skills, but there was more to it. But in terms of official discourse, it's not really part of the government, the Minister of Education documents. And but I know that there are associations that try to promote that. There's discussion, but officially speaking, unless it has changed in the past few months, there is nothing in writing on that in official, like, government documents. So, as I said, the role of the schools in Ontario in French language schools, it's really to protect the language and the culture. And to do that, the Ministry of Education has developed a language planning policy, and that policy was implemented in 2004. It's called La Politique d'Aménagement Linguistique. And that politics, is really, it's only for French language schools, and it's really about trying to make the school the center of the French-speaking community. So, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, because I think that what I understand from the conference here is that people want to hear how it's done in other type of similar settings. So the objectives of the policy on aménagement linguistique are I'm going to let you read it. And the second one is really the one that in l'imaginaire collectif within the teachers' population, that's the one. When they talk about that policy, they talk about the language and the culture. And that the policy is composed of 5 areas. And so l'axe de l'apprentissage, learning, if I go back to the previous slide, that corresponds to the first one. Okay, so l'axe de la construction identitaire, the identity construction, it's really the area that the ministry has emphasized a lot, and that the school boards have also taken as the most important, but I should not say that, I think it's my interpretation, but what I can see when I speak with people and when I look at what are the priorities in school boards, that identity construction is really important. And in the mind of the teachers, because I have done research with teachers quite a bit, and when they talk about identity construction and even the documents, it's really about the construction of a Francophone identity. And that's something which is interesting because, and I don't want to, start a very big debate here, but from my point of view, they're less accepting in terms of a very diverse school population. So when they look at identity construction, they really talk in terms of making the students little francophones when they graduate. And the reality, the same thing here in the population, the reality is not like that. In French language schools in Ontario, the language of use between kids, it's very much English. It's very similar when I did research in regions outside of Montreal in English-speaking schools in Quebec, and the kids will talk to each other in French. They are raised in French. So in Ontario, on the French language side, when you look at schooling, it's the same thing. It's really not necessarily, you're not going to succeed if you have in mind just that the kids become real francophones, because very often they don't live, they're not in the right context to do that. But anyway, so that's the 5 areas. And as I said, it really turns around how to give some vitality to the community. And that policy is very important in the context of Ontario. When I did my first research in the Montreal area, that's my first project, was with the youth in 2 high schools, in 2 different school boards, but one on the island, the other one not on the island. And I did some interviews with administrators, and because I was intrigued not to see anything about preserving the language and the culture in documents. And the first administrator that I spoke with clearly stated that the role of the schools were not to protect the culture, but to, to socialize, to instruct. And also, when I began, it was like in it was like 2008 or something like that. And it was clear that in the discourse, in the discourse of school boards, the importance of making sure that the kids have the linguistic skills in French to be able to compete on the labor market. And also, parents were telling me, well, we want that they stay here in Quebec. We don't want that they leave, to go to English-speaking milieu, either provinces or the states. And that discourse over the years stays, at least with people that I talk to. I'm not saying that, I don't want to generalize, but what I'm saying is that there is that fear that the kids are not prepared enough to become a real Quebecois citizen, being able to contribute to the society. So I found that interesting. And in terms of how the teachers see their role with the students in English-speaking schools, and those teachers were from different regions of the province, so not just in Montreal, but in other places. That's the way they see their role as teachers. And I had, when I did, especially the study with teachers in Anglophone schools here in Quebec, I used the life story approach, the life history approach. So it's based on interviews, but very detailed interviews. And, you talk about their lives in general. And I had that question about how they were making sense of their role as teachers in the minority language school. And none of them, I had 10 people, but none of my sample had ever really thought about that the school might have a different function or responsibility in terms of the kids, in terms of trying to, not necessarily transmitting English, because I don't think that English in people's mind, this is not something that will disappear because it's a strong language. I think that Colin Williams, when he presented this morning, we have to recognize that English is the language of globalization, but doesn't mean that there are stuff at stakes. I mean, there are some issues for people Anglophone in the context of the Anglophone schools in Quebec. And but one of them, it was Sally. She was she had retired, so she had a lot of experience. And when I asked the question, she said, I can see her. That's interesting. I never thought about that. So it's not something that is clear I mean, it's not in the mandate. Should it be? We could discuss that. But just to mention, in Ontario, in the French language schools of Ontario, even if we have that policy on the importance of preserving French and the culture, the teachers that I work with, very, very comparable study, didn't see their role as agent of cultural linguistic reproduction, especially for the linguistic reproduction. That's fine because they are in the French schools. They need to transmit the language. But in terms of culture, it was really difficult for them. In fact, they don't, like one of them or a few of them didn't know what culture we should be teaching because there are so many cultures in school. So, it's what I'm saying is that even when it is stated in an official document, it doesn't mean that it happened in the reality. So in terms of comparative analysis, the way that the teachers that I work with in the Anglophone schools here, it's very, very similar to the discourse of the teachers in my schools in Ontario. Very briefly, one very interesting fact, and that's why I'm saying that the situation is really different in terms of when you look at the two official minorities. In Ontario, the French is really seen, like teachers are seen as agent of regulation, and I'm going to explain myself. They're there to tell the student to speak French, because there is a lot of English, as I said, in the schools. And that's why I call that agent of language regulation, because they're there. In fact, the practice is a bit different now, but for a long time, kids would receive tickets, or they would receive awards if they were speaking French. They would get tickets, penalty tickets, if they were speaking English. Not the best way to encourage the use of a language, but anyway. So, so that's very important in the imaginaire collectif in the French language schools in Ontario. When I did my research, I did 3 major research projects in the English-speaking schools here in Quebec. And the only school that I didn't hear too much French was a school that was really on the island, which a very large population of Italian students. And in that school, it was really English. You would not necessarily notice that you were in a minority language school. The other one was on the South Shore. And there was a big mix of French and English in the schools. And my other schools were, my last project, were in 2 regions out of Montreal. And there it was really French speaking, like this is between students, but also between teachers, because a lot of them are French speaking. Just a little note on that. When I work in French language schools in Ontario, I never use English because first, French is my first language. But, you know, just to respect the minority language, I use the language. So when I began to work in anglophone schools in Montreal, when I met the principals, it was okay. They were English speaking, so I was speaking English. I decided to speak English and have the kids talk to me in English. But I face a big challenge because people began to talk to me in French. Because of my accent, it's clear that I'm not English speaking. So as a researcher, it was kind of funny because I didn't want to use French because, you know, you're in an English-speaking school. But at the same time, people were talking to me in French. Just how many of you do research in the room here? Is anybody? So it's probably not as funny. If you were a researcher, you would find that more funny. Okay, I am not going to insist on that, but that's that just show you the diversity in terms of language practices, just in that instance. Okay. About that linguistic regulation, one thing that a vice principal told me is that they don't want to police the hallways because in that particular schools, a lot of kids were from exogamous families where one parent is French-speaking, the other is English-speaking, and they really did not think that it was such a big deal that, you know, there were some practices in French, which for me show that English is a powerful language because this is not the way that the French, the francophones in Ontario think. Okay, and oui, c'est ça, ça devrait même pas être 2. Okay, the last thing that I want to mention is that in francophone settings at the school level, people feel that French is threatened. It's really the majority language, the English language, is a threat to the minority language. Okay, and it's very, very clear. As I said before, here, from what I have seen, the language is not the main issue in terms of preserving that language, but it's more the infrastructure, it's more the services that are diminishing. It's the vitality of the community, but not necessarily the disappearance of English as a minority language in Quebec.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'd like to begin my presentation this morning by telling you the ending, how it's going to end. And it's going to end something like this. In 2016 and 2017, many of you may remember, there was a fair amount of disquiet within the English-speaking community in Quebec over the provincial government's new history program that they were bringing into secondary schools. There were interviews on the radio and on TV. There were articles in the newspaper. There were op-ed pieces. I even think there was an editorial that all came to the same conclusion, that the problem or the fault of the fact that in this new history program, the English-speaking community was essentially ignored. They were there in bits and pieces, but they were essentially ignored, as were the indigenous nations, as were ethnic communities. And the fault always was, it was the government's fault. It was the Ministry of Education's fault. It was the bureaucrats' fault. And every time I read that and heard that, I kept thinking to myself, boy, are these guys wrong? Because it wasn't the Ministry of Education's fault, and it wasn't the bureaucrats' fault. So whose fault was it, you're asking? Well, it was Concordia University's fault. You didn't understand that, or you may not appreciate that, but it was Concordia's fault. And it was also McGill University's fault. And it's Bishop's University's fault. They are the problem, not the government in this particular case. So why you're asking, why was it their fault? Why was it Concordia's fault, McGill's fault, Bishop's fault? Well, I'll tell you why when I get to the end of my presentation. Now I want to go to the front of my presentation and tell you how it's going to begin. And it begins like this. I want to tell you a story now, and it's a true story. And it's a story of English Quebec studies, found and lost. I played a minor role in the development of English Quebec studies. It was a peripheral role, but it gave me an opportunity to see how it was taking root in Quebec and in Quebec studies and in Quebec universities. And then it was evident that it died, or almost died. Until the 1980s, English Quebec didn't have a history. English Quebecers didn't have a history. We had no history. We were in the same position that French Quebec was in 1840. And in 1840, some of you will remember, Quebec had just gone through the rebellions. A new governor general came into Quebec, or into Lower Canada, as it was called, who was charged with figuring out what caused this problem, these rebellions, and what was the solution. And there are two statements in Lord Durham's report. Lord Durham was the governor general. There were two statements in his report that everybody quotes and latches onto. The first one was that he said, when he came to Lower Canada, he found two nations warring in the bosom of the single state. That was the English nation and the French nation. They were warring among each other. The second memorable quote is that he said, French Canada, or French Canadians, and in this case he meant Quebecers, or the Québécois, French Canadians do not have a history or a literature. And he was right. They didn't have a history, because like English Quebec up until the 1980s, no one had written the history. So if you don't have a written history, you don't have a history. And that was the logic of Lord Durham, and that's the case it was for English Quebecers. There was just no history. So I came to this understanding or realization that we didn't have a history on the evening of November the 15th, 1976. And on that evening, my brother Kevin and I were sitting in Toblake's Tavern, which is wherever St. Catherine Street is, just down the street here, a memorable institution. We were sitting in Toblake's Tavern watching the election results that were coming in that evening. It was the provincial elections. The government of Robert Bourassa, the Liberal government, was falling. And for the first time, a separatist party, the Parti Québécois, were taking power. And they came to power with an understanding or a veiled distrust of English-speaking Quebec and English-speaking Quebecers. And so Kevin and I were sitting there watching, listening to the election results come in, and more the PQ were winning and the Liberals were losing. And so we turned away from the TV set, as most of the people were by that point in the evening. And we started talking about, well, what exactly, why is it that there is a problem here with English-speaking Quebecers? And why is there this distrust within the French-speaking community? Because English-speaking Quebecers, from our point of view at that point, was that we had gone through the Quiet Revolution. We had seen the changes that had taken place. We had seen the rise of statism in Quebec. and the Quebec government since the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, the Quebec government taking over institutions that had been traditionally controlled by the English-speaking community, health, education, social services. These were all under provincial domination or community domination. All of a sudden now the Quebec government was taking them over or had taken them over. There had been, for a century, between 1850 and into the 1950s, there had been what political scientists refer to as a consociational accommodation. And for those of you who don't know that term, don't remember that term, it's a theory that was developed in Europe by a political scientist named Art Lipschart. He described how communities that are divided, that have cleavages between religion, language, culture, class, they can still survive, and they have survived. Countries like Belgium, Scandinavia, Switzerland, Lebanon, they went together, they continue to survive, and yet they have these fundamental cleavages within their society. How did they do it? Well, it was mutually accepted segregation. These communities decided that they would keep the majority of the people apart. They would create their own parts of their society that they wanted to control: education, health, social services. And they would not, the vast majority would not come into contact with each other. So it's an inverted V. That's how they saw it. If there was a problem within these communities, it's at the top level. The elites, usually the political elites, come together, and that's how problems are solved. And that existed from the time after the rebellion in 1837 up until the burning of the Parliament buildings in Montreal in 1849. After that, that's when it was decided to enter into this, what became known as a consociational accommodation. And it existed up until the Quiet Revolution. Comes the Quiet Revolution, there's a new middle class evolves in French Quebec, and they say, whoa, wait a minute, we don't like this type of society. We want to take it over and control it, and therefore it ended the consociational accommodation. So that's one thing that we had lived through, the statism, the end of consociational accommodation. Also, we lived through the beginnings of the language the debates. And most of you remember back in the 1970s, or actually before that, in the 1960s, there was the St. Leonard crisis, the school crisis in St. Leonard over which language a parent can send their child to. And it was decided at that point that the government would dictate who or what language a child could go to school in. So the parent no longer had that choice. So you have Bill 22. First of all, you have Bill 63 under the Union Nationale in 1969. You have Bill 22 under the Liberal government in 1974. And on that evening in 1976, as Kevin and I were sitting in Toll Blake's Tavern, you had a government coming into power that said, we're going to bring in a bill, one of the first bills we're going to bring, the first bill that we're going to bring into legislation will be a charter of the French language, a charter that would, in effect, make French the language of work, the language of education, the language of communication, the language of commerce, the language of business for everyone. Okay? They said they were going to call this Bill 1, but for procedural reasons they couldn't, and they ended up calling it Bill 101. It was also during this time of after the Quiet Revolution, up to the 1970s, that the relationship between Francophones and Anglophones changed. Anglophones, English-speaking people, used to be known as les Anglais. And les Anglais were, in French terms, were the oppressors, the exploiters, the people who kept them down. Come the Quiet Revolution and the evolution, we are no longer called les Anglais. We are now called les Anglophones. Les Anglophones are the people, are a minority people, okay? They are not vrai Québécois. They are a minority. They're just not one of us. And if you look in Bill 101, for example, that's where you will find Anglophones. If you look in Bill 101, it's very clear. It says there are two types of people in Quebec, francophones and les autres. And we are one of now les autres. What's the problem here? Kevin came up with the solution. He said, the problem is we don't have a history. So if we don't have a history, then how will we go about creating that history or writing that history? And so we kicked this idea around, and we said, well, the first thing we would have to do is create a bibliography to find out what were the secondary sources that existed already about the English-speaking community if someone were going to write the history of the English-speaking community. So I said, fine, I'll do that. I'll go out and put together a bibliography. And I didn't think this was going to be a hard task because, I mean, how many books and articles were there on English-speaking Quebec in the 1970s? So I went out and bought a package of 3x5 index cards, just like this. Okay? And I remember when I bought this thing, I think I paid $1 for a stack of 100 of them, and thinking, wow, I just wasted 50 cents. Because there's no way I'm going to find 100 articles on the English-speaking Quebec. But I kept plugging away, and this was in a period of the pre-internet period. So I had to go into libraries and go into those card catalogs, or little card. I don't know if any of you remember them, but you have to go through the cards, and you get you find your book or whatever. There was, I would go by hand, I would go through journals, I would look at bibliographies at the end of an article to find out where the person found his or her information, and if any of that could be put into the bibliography as well. It was also during this time that I came across a book that is not relative to English Quebec history, and here I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent. It wasn't relative to English-speaking Quebec, but it was a published transcript of a TV program called The Craft of History. And in this program, there was an interview with a Quebec historian called Michel Brunet. And Brunet had a quote in there that struck home with me because it's exactly what I was trying to do with this bibliography. And the quote goes like this. He told the interviewer, who was another historian, Ramsey Cook, he said, "A minority cannot blame the majority for not understanding it, as long as the minority doesn't have the knowledge, the science, and the courage to define itself." And that's exactly what Kevin and I were thinking about that evening in Toll Blake's Tavern, that we have to find the courage to define ourselves. So I started collecting material for this bibliography. At that time then, I met Robin Burns. Now, I don't know how many of you know or knew of Robin Burns. Robin was a history professor here at Concordia University. He had done his research on Irish Montreal. First, he did his master's and his PhD on Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And he was beginning to get into the field of English Quebec studies. He was also a director of the Canadian Studies program here at Concordia. And so he had this idea of this interdisciplinary approach to looking at a society, at the Canadian society. Then he thought, well, let's see what we could do with Quebec society. So he encouraged me to continue on. And in 1978, he hired me as his research assistant to begin to work on the bibliography, not to begin it, because the beginning had already taken place. He just said, okay, I'll fund you to do this for a year. So I sat in a little office that he had over on Mackay Street and started putting together the bibliography. And Robin said, when you put together the bibliography, cast the net as wide as possible. Try and don't just include history, but look at things like cultural geography, economics, art, literature, poetry, sociology, anything and everything, past and present, that could be of interest to English-speaking Quebecers or anyone researching information on English-speaking Quebecers. In 1982, Robin moved from Concordia University to Bishop's University. He was in their history department. He moved to their history department, but at the same time, he also took over the director of the Eastern Townships Research Center. Robin came to me and he said, when he got into Bishop's, and he said, okay, we've got a grant from the Ministry of Education to publish, or we got a grant from the Eastern Townships Research Center. He said, we'd like to publish the bibliography. This was in 1985. So the volume 1 of the bibliography came out in 1985. It covered the period up to 1980. Also in 1985, there was also a growing movement towards English Quebec studies. It became evident. And there were 3 books that came out as well as along with the bibliography at that time. The first book was Sheila Arnopoulos and Dominic Cliff's book. Came out first in French called Le Fait Anglais, Quebec, and it then was translated next year as the English Fact in Quebec. This book is a series of 12 essays that these 2 individuals wrote. The bottom line of their thesis is English Quebecers have to integrate. You have to give up this idea of segregation and get into this, move towards the integration into Quebec society. The second book that came out during this time was in 1982, was this book by a sociologist called Gary Caldwell and a geographer called Eric Waddell. They were the editors of this book. It's a series of 22 different essays by individuals. The bottom line of many of the articles in there as well said, we have to move away from this idea of segregation and move, again, more towards integration. The third book, and probably the most important book that came out in the 1980s, was this particular book, the first history of English-speaking Quebec that was written by an academic. Okay? It was written by Ron Rudin, a history professor here at Concordia, aptly called The Forgotten Quebecers, because that's essentially what we were in Quebec society at that time. And that covers a period up to 1980s. Now, Rudin in his book said, in his preface of his book, lamented the fact that unlike those people who wrote about French Quebec history, he didn't have all the secondary sources that were available to those people writing about French Quebec. And he lamented that, and it's evident in the book. The book was not meant to be the definitive study of English Quebec. But unfortunately, no one has continued or picked up on that, and there is no history of English-speaking Quebec other than that academic history of English-speaking Quebec, except that particular book. It was not meant to be the definitive one, but by default, it becomes the definitive one. So I kept plugging away anyway, so volume 1 came out. I kept plugging away. Oh, I should also mention at the same time, Concordia University created the Center for Anglophone Studies. Again, it was Ron Rudin and Graham DeCary. They created this Center for Anglophone Studies. They began teaching a course on Anglophone history here. So now you had Bishop's University teaching a course on the history. You have Concordia and Bishop's teaching it. You have these two organizations, the Center for Anglophone Studies and the Eastern Townships Research Center out at Bishop's. And it seemed that all of a sudden, English Quebec studies is taking off in the 1980s. In 1992, Robin phoned me up. He said, okay, it's time maybe to publish volume 2 of the bibliography. So volume 2 comes out in 1992. It has 1,500 titles in it, okay? And it covers up the period between 1980 and 1990. Sadly then, in 1998, Robin Burns died. He passed away, okay? I kept looking up and looking for titles on English Quebec. In 2008, 2008, QUESCREN comes into being. I was approached by QUESCREN. They said they were interested in the bibliography. I said, okay, I'll go and talk to bishops, see what their plans are. Bishops said, the Eastern Township Research Center said they had no funding to continue this project. So QUESCREN takes it over. They published volume 3 that covers the period up to 2000 and I think it's 2005 or 2008. There were, again, in that period from 1990 to 2008, the bibliography has 2,700 titles in it. In 2010, as QUESCREN is getting off the ground, they needed something. They needed something for their launching. They needed a bibliography. So that they published the 3rd volume, and I retired in 2010 from the federal government. We started putting this online, okay? And now online, there are 11,700 titles in this bibliography, and you can find that bibliography online at QUESCREN's website. So what's the situation now of English Quebec studies? Well, the Eastern Township Research Center still exists, but it is slowly, it's underfunded and has been for a long time. No longer, since Robin died, they no longer teach English Quebec history at Bishop's University. The Center for Anglophone Studies here at Concordia imploded after a couple of years. It only published 1 bibliography on books that have been written on Quebec history in English, which is a sort of a bizarre title, a bizarre take on what was needed. They stopped, after a few years, they stopped teaching English Quebec history here. QUESCREN, English Township Research Center still exists. QUESCREN came into being in 2010, but it does not teach. There has no teaching responsibilities associated with it. It is very much of a research network, as everybody explains. So where are we? Well, this gets us back to the problem over the history program that the Quebec government wanted to bring in. Why was it the fault of Concordia and McGill and Bishops? It's simple. It's because nobody teaches the teachers how to teach or what is about English Quebec history. There is a need to bring the English Quebec studies into the classroom, and it brings it back into the universities, the 3 English language universities, because, as Michel Brunet said, a minority cannot blame the majority for not understanding it if the minority doesn't have the knowledge, the science, and the courage to define itself. We have to define ourselves. Thank you.
I think there's some points in common between your 2 talks. Brendan blames the universities, but I think perhaps, as Diane was saying, maybe there's not enough education at the before the university level to kind of inculcate this idea of an identity.
Yeah, but see, my argument is that how can a teacher teach the history and the identity if they've never been taught themselves?
Right. Well, it's sort of a...
And who teaches them? Well, they're taught at the university.
So before I take questions, I have one question for Diane. You mentioned that there's lots of diversity in schools, Francophone schools in Ontario, people from West and North African backgrounds in Toronto, for instance. And I'm just wondering, when you're talking about transmitting an identity, transmitting a culture, what Francophone identity is transmitted? Is it a very narrow Franco-Ontarian definition with the famille souche and the history, or is it a broader one that looks at all territories of the francophonie? And I guess the second question is that a model, that we should, do you think we should sort of have that model here, based on the Ontario experience?
Yeah. In regards to the notion of culture, this is not something that is still a little bit, in a gray zone in the French language schools in Ontario, and I think outside of Ontario also in the Francophones, minorities. Now people talk when they talk about to reproduce the French language. When they come to culture, they say most likely something like une culture d'expression française, which sounds inclusive, but I think that in the fact there has always been a debate between the Francophone minority and the newcomers, which is a minority within a minority. It's like a double minority for immigrants that come to the schools, for example, you know. So because the Francophone minority has been a minority for so long and not having, you know, all the rights that they wanted to get. When immigration began in the middle of the 90s, there was really like, it was polarized, in fact, and talking about francophone de souche and the others. So the language now, the official, you know, discourse on that, it's more inclusive. In fact, in Ontario now, and I think that François Boileau mentioned it yesterday, like everybody that speaks French is considered as a Francophone, even if their first language is not French. The challenge in the schools is that we are under that multicultural education paradigm, that all, you know, diversity is good, everybody is welcome, a lot of respect, but it's still very much, I don't know if you if you know the expression, the food and festival notion, that when kids, when you have a lot of immigrant kids in a school, the school will promote, like, you know, lunches, traditional lunches, and music and everything, and nothing is wrong with that. But it stays very much at a superficial level, I find, and we have the same thing in the French language schools. So that thing with culture and talking with, as I said, talking with teachers, they don't know what culture we're talking about. So there is some work to do on that level, at, you know, within the schools, but also I think still at the ministry level too. Okay. So I don't have a very. So they're still kind of they're still accommodating the diversity. They're still. Yeah. Trying to. Yeah, but it's really like there's still others. Mm-hmm. You know, right. It's. Are there any questions? Des questions?
I really appreciate what you had to say. I'm just wondering whether you would solely blame the universities for because what you're arguing is pretty strong. You're saying that it's because Concordia, McGill, and Bishops didn't maintain or fund a Quebec English-speaking Quebec studies program. That is one of the reasons why the new history program has excluded the experiences of English speakers and minority groups and other like subgroups or other minority groups in the province. I understand where you're coming from, but I'm just curious also to what extent you would think, to what extent do you think there are other factors also? Because I'm wondering, because my understanding, prior to the Quiet Revolution and the Commission Parent, both communities taught their own histories in schools, and once the Ministry of Education was created in Quebec, there was one curriculum for all Quebecers, and that kind of jump-started a debate or a competition or what have you between English speakers and French speakers, where French speakers were trying to promote their own understanding of the Quebec. It was like a nation-building process. And then minority groups were always trying to get their perspectives into their curriculum somehow. So I understand where you're coming from, saying that if there isn't, quote-unquote, a story that one can relate to, then don't blame the Ministry of Education. But I'm wondering to what extent there are also like nationalist interest groups among certain Francophone intellectuals who are keen on keeping, quote-unquote, the Anglophone other out of the nation-building project for whatever reasons come to mind in terms of protecting one's identity, one's language, et cetera, et cetera. So do you really think that it's Concordia's fault and McGill's fault and Bishop's fault that the Quebec Ministry of Education rejected or left out English-speaking people's perspectives?
Yes, I do. It's a simple word. You're right that there was this idea, or once the Ministry of Education was created in the 1960s, 64 I think it was, and they took over the educational curriculum for the schools. At that same time, there was this building of a nationalist idea within Quebec, and especially within Quebec Francophone Quebec historians. They were the one pushing their view of history. There was a lot less, in fact, almost none on the English Quebec side. English Quebecers at that time, until the 1980s, didn't see themselves, at least from my view, didn't see themselves as being Quebecers. They were English Canadians who lived in Quebec. They didn't see themselves as a minority. They were part of the English Canadian majority. Okay, so that was their history. But the French, it was on the French side that they were publishing books and articles and theses and dissertations that promoted their nationalist viewpoint. And when these consultants who were hired by the Ministry of Education to develop this new history program that came out, where did this, I presume it was one individual, where did he or she go to find out something about, for example, English Quebec? He had never, or she had never been taught that in her school, in high school, in university. They never approached it from that side, that these people had a history. So they went to the one book that existed, this one. This is a 30-year-old book, or 30-plus-year-old book. If there was more research and more studies and more teachers coming out of Concordia, coming out of McGill, coming out of Bishop's, in my view, I think there would be at least an ability to put forward a viewpoint of saying, yeah, okay, yeah, that's the Québécois-centric view of the world. But let me tell you the English Quebec view of the world. And the English Quebec view of the world looks at things very differently. They would look at the post-conquest period up until the 1790s one way. Different than the Francophone nationalist perspective was that this was a conquering and an oppression. They would say, no, it wasn't. They would look at the period from 1790 to 1850, where on the Quebec nationalist side, they see this as a period of the reign of terror of people like Governor Craig, who were putting in jail and arresting people for their nationalist viewpoints. And if you looked at it from the English Quebec side, they closed in on themselves, the English community, because they feared that Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, remember they went through the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, and then Napoleon and the wars. They figured that the French were going to come back with the aid of the United States and attack Canada and the French Canadians would rise up and join them. So they circled their wagons. Okay, that lasted until the 1850. After that, we get into the period of consociational accommodation. Those are very distinct periods that we can explain and counter some of the views that the Quebec nationalist perspective does. But you can't do that if the teachers don't understand it themselves. Because you can bring in this new history program, and there's elements of it that says, well, yeah, you go out and do some of your local history. But you have to understand the big picture as well as the local history. And if you don't understand, or if you only understand the big picture from one perspective, then you cannot explain the local stuff. And I blame that, personally, I blame that on the universities, that the three universities started this English Quebec Studies program in the 1980s and then dropped it. And if they had not dropped it, there would be more ability to say, wait a minute, that's a Quebecois centric. Let me look at it from our point of view, because history is not a set of simple facts and there's no interpretation involved. It's the interpretation of facts. And so that's why I blame the universities for letting the English community down.
And a hand of applause to our two speakers.